his trial before Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would be fighting. And Pilate said, well, that's no threat to me. And in the debate, I raised this question. I pointed out, why is that so? And it's so important that as Christians, if I might say so to the Christians who are in this audience tonight, that we make this very clear. It's the very nature of the Christian message that demands that it cannot be imposed by force. You cannot bring a message of love and forgiveness at the end of a gun, and so on. And we need to differentiate. So that's one side of the argument. But may I say another point on this, Stephen? Because Dawkins said, imagine with John Lennon, a world with no Taliban, no Northern Ireland, no this. And I said, well, I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox. And I said, I want you to imagine a world with no atheism, no Mao, no Stalin, no Pol Pot, no Gulag. What about that? And one of the major criticisms I have of this book is that Dawkins and others, they aren't prepared to differentiate between religions. There's no differentiation. We're going to have to differentiate. But they do want to differentiate between atheists, as I made the point to him in the debate, as you'll see elsewhere. I said, if I said that Stalin's an atheist and you're an atheist, therefore you're equally likely to do what he did, you'd be insulted. I'd be the first to defend you against that charge. You want to make a differentiation between atheists. I asked him publicly to write another book in which he'd make a differentiation between religions. And it's fascinating to me that Sam Harris, this man here, has backed off this position just recently at a public lecture in America, and he says we've got to give up throwing all religions in the same pot, because it is destroying our own case. It's making us look ridiculous. Because to put the Amish or the Quakers in the same pot as fundamentalist Islamists and so on. So what I want to say is what concerns me most about this book is not the attack on theology. I'd expect that from the new atheists. It's the attack on history. Dawkins says he cannot conceive of an atheist who would blow up Chartres, Notre Dame or anything else. Has he never been to Russia and seen what Stalin did in blowing up hundreds of churches?
Well, he says, doesn't he, that they didn't do that because they were atheists. There were other reasons, but it wasn't the atheism that acted as the motive for whatever they did.
That's right. And I think he's wrong there. I showed the debate in Poland not long ago, and when it came to this point, the audience started laughing. And I stopped and asked what was going on. They had said, send him over here. Doesn't he realize that the heart of Marxism, the first criticism Marx says is a criticism of religion? That's where we must start and get rid of it. And so on. And they just said, and this is their communist background reaction, not mine, and that's far more important. They just said it's quite clear he hasn't a clue about the implications of Marxism. Now, I've tried to understand that objection. You know, I don't believe in God. How could that harm anybody?
Yes, he says, for example, here, page 273, what matters is not whether Hitler and Stalin were atheists, but whether atheism systematically influences people to do bad things. There's not the smallest evidence that it does. So he seems to be saying, yes, they were atheists, perhaps. Perhaps they were, perhaps they weren't. But whatever we know is that it wasn't their atheism which drove them to do these horrible things. Whereas, someone else has said that it takes religion to make good people do horrible things.
I told him a little story to really pinpoint this. The story was personal story, where I sat in East Germany in the time of the German Democratic Republic in a home where a 13-year-old girl had just come home from school weeping. She was brilliant, she was top in the class, had been for years. And I was in the home as the guest, and we wanted to know what had happened to her. She said, I've just been told I can't study anymore because I'm not an atheist. And I asked Dawkins, have you ever sat beside a girl like that? There are thousands of people like that. Atheism was directly responsible for the termination of their education, and I call that intellectual murder. I just think it betrays a total unawareness of the fact that Atheism is not simply a negative doctrine. Literally, of course, the word atheism means you don't believe in God. But it is positive entailments. And it was those positive entailments that allowed Stalin to unleash the horrific persecution of Christians that he unleashed. And if you come to add up how much blood has flowed, then the 20th century under atheism has been far worse than any time before. That doesn't excuse, of course, the religious things. And I think we will lose sympathy very quickly. We have a major job to do, those of us who are professing Christians, to explain to the world the differences. The differences now matter.
Well, they not only say that it's been harmful in the past, but they say it's harmful in the present. And one of the very telling points they make is that the indoctrination of children is a harmful thing. And in particular, to tell children that they're going to suffer eternally in fire and hell if they don't behave the way mummy and daddy and the priest or the minister says, is the cruelest form of child abuse. Surely they're right.
Well, I think there's a very big element of truth in what they say, and they apply that too to teaching young children to strap bombs to themselves and become human bombs, so to speak. I think these things need to be taken very seriously indeed. I said earlier on that one of the things that I am immensely grateful to my parents for was in a country that was characterized by sectarianism. My parents gave me space to think. And I know many young people whose parents, even from an evangelical perspective, did not give them space to think.
And I've heard you say that your father encouraged you to read Karl Marx.
That's right. That's right.
Did it do you any harm?
No, it didn't do me any harm at all. In fact,
good?
I think it did me a lot of good, because it later was to become a subject for study as I could see what I would hold to be the weaknesses of atheism. And I think we need to be very careful with the way in which, now speaking as a Christian, we use doctrine. The particular thing you mentioned, lurid descriptions of hell, you'll not find Christ talking to children about that. The interesting thing is he talked mostly about topics like that to bigoted religious people. And so that sense of sensitivity, of not crushing a child's spirit, Christ's attitude to children is so clear. Allow the little kids to come to me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. He welcomed them with a joy. And we ought to ask ourselves what way we are conveying the idea of God and the teaching about God to children.
But they take it beyond children, John.
Oh yes, of course they do.
And they say that it's one thing to abuse children, as religion does, but adults are also abused, that they're held in fear and trepidation, their lives are spoiled, they're not able to develop without this anxiety about some sort of super policeman, super monitor who's going to ultimately punish them, and their lives are marred by this delusion.
Well, we've all met people who feel exactly like that. And I find when I meet people like that, whatever religion they're involved in, I find that's very sad. And the answer to it is not to define Christianity, if we're talking about Christianity for the moment, by caricatures of it. Because where in that kind of description is a sense of the love of God, a sense of forgiveness, a sense of peace with God. And I would be the first to admit, having talked to many people brought up in different backgrounds, that there can be that distortion of things, so that people are more afraid than they have a sense of peace. And you need to pour the antidote of peace into their hearts. We need to be so careful that we grasp the essence of the Christian good news. It is, after all, supposed to be good news. And so, although many of those criticisms are validated, I would want to correct them, not by giving up Christianity, because it seems to me that some of these books get very near to wanting to indoctrinate children with atheism. And the experiments in doing that I have experienced directly in Eastern Europe have been horrific. So the answer is not indoctrination in that negative sense in both directions, but teaching children in a loving environment and adults and all the rest of it, so that all these doctrines get put in correct proportion. Because you cannot, if the first commandment, for example, is love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, you can't induce that by fear. And the trouble is, there are brutal religious people around, I would confess that to Richard Dawkins, who love to be king among kids and browbeat them, and so on and so forth. And that is a horrific thing.
Now, you talked about loving God and the good news.
Yes.
One of the points that Dawkins seems to get most agitated about is the idea of a God who punishes.
Yes.
And the God who punishes, in particular Jesus, the idea of the atonement,
Yes.
he seems to find repulsive, and he describes it in terms which are very strong.
Yes. Well, Dawkins spends less time on it than Christopher Hitchens, who describes it in lurid detail in his God is Not Great. Well, he simply asserts that it's immoral. Well, I'm not very impressed with that, because first of all, he says it's immoral, and I think I wouldn't want to misquote him. I don't have the exact quotation in my mind, but he says he can understand somebody paying a fine for someone else, or somebody even dying for someone else. But the idea that if I have offended you, if I've sinned against you, that a third party could come in and say you're forgiven without consulting you is utterly absurd. Well, yes, it is. Hitchens is completely right, unless the third party is God. And what I think he hasn't taken on board, he simply makes the assertion, there's no evidence for it. He simply states it's immoral. I don't think it is, if the third party involved is God. But let's step back just a minute, because the first part of your question had to do with something I think is immensely important in this whole debate. A lot of the criticisms of God are that God judges, and various descriptions made of that. But I would want to argue that a world without judgment, Dawkins, of course, doesn't believe there is a God, so there's no final judgment, is a world without hope. Because what he doesn't say, and it's what these books don't say, that moves me greatly. They have no hope. They are, strictly speaking, atheism is a hopeless faith. It is a faith, of course, although Dawkins he doesn't accept that, because, again, as I pointed out just in that last extract, which was heavily compressed, ladies and gentlemen, because the radio people told us we had to finish in 2 minutes rather than 7, so it cut the last little bit of the DV down terribly. The point I was trying to make there is this, that we human beings have an inbuilt sense of justice. Now, if there is no God, and say I'm a terrorist, or I'm a dictator, I'm a Stalin, or I'm a Pol Pot, and I live my life as I like, I murder millions of people, I live in absolute luxury, and if the enemy gets to me in the end, I just put a pistol in my brains, I blow it out, that's the finish. So, I've had it all my way. We got to die sometime. I've escaped scot-free. That contradicts every sense of justice we've got. And what I find so ironical is that Dawkins saying we can't have God as judge, when that's the very thing he needs to give the universe moral stability. Of course, his caricature of God's judgment is another matter. But the notion that there is to be a totally fair final assessment is one that I find enormously encouraging, being a person who's visited Auschwitz many times and having to talk to people who are hurting, as many people are, desperately hurting. Will it ever be put right? Ask atheism what kind of a world it's bringing you to. It's a world in which nothing will ever be put right, except the things we can put right in this life. It is totally hopeless. Now, of course, it may be true, as you were saying, but we need to be very sure it is true. And we need to, I would say, be wary of going down the atheist route simply because of a caricature of a doctrine of judgment, that is, by Dawkins, which is actually a wonderful thing. And I'm very struck by some of the expressions in Hebrew poetry in the Old Testament where the writer of Psalms would say, let the trees clap and the mountains sing and the earth rejoice because God is coming to judge. And you say, what? Why should I rejoice that God is coming to judge? Well, you would, if you ended your days in a gas chamber.